Hello, welcome to Best Top 5, the most criminally underrated show here on YouTube that nobody watches. It usually ends up on the weird side of this channel. But anyway, today we're going to go over the top 5 horror remakes of all time. Making a remake on its own is a difficult feat. Most remakes end up being generic. They always do the same thing over and over again with nothing special or new. When I see a remake and I feel it stands out, is usually because they did something completely different from what the original film did. And you're going to notice in this list, some of these movies may surpass the original, others are close to what the original did, and I like that. Because there's terrible remakes, I can mention several. Some that come to mind is The Fog. There's a remake of the John Carpenter film. While not completely terrible, it's just blah. There's nothing there. Same thing with the remake of Poltergeist. The original still stands out as a classic with great practical effects and great directing, but then you watch the remake and it's just very generic, terrible CGI, and the movie probably came out, what, 2-3 years ago, and the effects are already dated? That shows you that it's not a good remake, and they almost try to do scenes almost shot for shot identical to what the original did. A perfect example is also the movie Psycho, directed by Gus Van Sant, the remake of the Alfred Hitchcock film. That movie is a scene-by-scene remake that's redundant and has no meaning or purpose. The ones on this list, however, are actually very different, innovative, and you can watch them probably on any streaming platform, or you can also get them on Blu-ray. Number 5 is a movie that was released in 2002. This movie is still good to this day, even though there's certain things within the storyline that are probably dated, and that movie is The Ring. This is a remake of the Japanese film called Ringu. Now, Ringu is actually pretty good. I like it. It was a lower budget horror film, and this remake was a was a bigger production film. And it's cleverly directed, it has great cinematography, and of course people are going to complain that no one uses VHS anymore. And they made a recent, I don't know if it was a reboot or kind of like a loose, soft reboot sequel of Ring called Rings, where it's actually live streaming of the video that you see in the movie The Ring, and it was terrible. Curious enough, the remake, the original remake of The Ring, still stands out. It's basically people encounter a VHS tape, they get a phone call that they're going to die in 7 days, and this weird girl pops out of the TV named Samara, and they have to find a way to stop her. The movie uses very little jump scares. I hate jump scares because that's a cheap way of scaring the audience. And you know those jump scares, the music already tells you that it's coming. It goes really, really loud, and you get a jolt just because the music is loud, not because you're genuinely scared. While there are probably 1 or 2 jump scares in The Ring, it's mostly how the film was shot. One scene in particular that stands out is the scene where the boyfriend of Naomi Watts' character, she's the main character in this film, he's watching the tape, and the scene where she pops out of the TV, that scene is actually a wide angle shot, and it takes a while for that scene to take a cut. It stays and lingers for a long time, and it's unnerving and creepy. That's why when you make an effective horror movie, typically you are afraid of what you can't explain, what you can't describe, like what's going on, why is this scene stretching out for so long, it becomes kind of unnerving. This movie still stands out. The sequel, Ring 2, don't watch it, and don't watch also the remake that they did. I don't know if it's a remake or a reboot, I don't know what it was, but I saw a snippet of it online and it wasn't worth it. So stick to the original, it's still a great movie, and I would say actually is on par with Ringu that was released a few years before it. Number 4 is a remake that I won't say it surpasses the original, but it's actually a good homage, and it's also a good movie that does its own thing. And the movie is Evil Dead, the remake of The Evil Dead. The Evil Dead, if you've never seen it, it's a great little movie directed by Sam Raimi and starring Bruce Campbell. It's a group of kids who go to a cabin, they read from a book they're not supposed to, and all havoc breaks loose, and the dead come back to life and they start killing people one by one. The remake is very similar, only thing is that they don't try to remake the character of Ash. They do their own thing. They cast a female lead, and she's completely different to how Ash is. Now, this remake that was released in 2013 is clever in avoiding that CGI crap that I can't stand. This one they use all practical effects for the most part. There's probably some things that were enhanced using CGI, but they use a lot of gore, a lot of gore. I don't know how this got through the MPAA, it didn't get an X rating, or maybe it did, they probably trimmed down some stuff, but it was pretty gory. And what I like is that there's actually a reason for them going to that little cabin. In the original, it's a little more comedic as to why they go to that cabin, especially in the sequel. Like, how is it that Ash is so dumb to go back to the same cabin? This one, the main character, the girl who is taking place over the principal character of Ash, she's an addict, a drug addict, and she wants to go to somewhere where she has no means of getting drugs. I mean, she could just go to a rehabilitation clinic, but she decides to go to a cabin. But at least to give an explanation. This remake, even though it came out, what, 4 or 5 years ago, it still holds up very well. If you can release this movie now in theaters, and it still will probably play well. I can say the same thing about the original Evil Dead with Bruce Campbell. So anyway, that was my number 4. Number 3 is actually the only movie that I like from Zack Snyder. I know a lot of people like Zack Snyder. They like the movie 300, and there's some people who actually like Batman vs. Superman. Bunch of weirdos. But I think the only movie of his that still is good is Dawn of the Dead. This is a remake to the George A. Romero classic that was released in the 70s. And unlike the original one, where it was more of a social commentary, the zombies were there just for horror effect. If you watch that movie, especially you watch it now, it's actually still very relatable to the whole thing about consumerism. The remake by Zack Snyder is more of a straight horror remake. While it does still take place in a mall, just like it did in the original Dawn of the Dead, they do things that are completely different. Like, there's a sequence where there's a zombie baby, and you would think that would be really ridiculous and really dumb, but they did a really good job, and you actually have empathy for the characters in that particular scene. The only downside to this remake, which is one of the few reasons I wouldn't put it as better than the original, is the fact that the zombies run. The thing is that, like, in movies like 28 Days Later or The Crazies, it makes sense there because they're infected with a virus and they're still alive, so they can still run. But zombies are dead. They're technically just reanimated corpses, so they're gonna break down, you know. Of course, I'm trying to make sense out of something that's never gonna happen, I hope. I like this movie for the fact that it's genuinely really scary, and the way it's shot, unlike some of the other films that Zack Snyder did, we actually see contrast and bright colors. In all of other Zack Snyder's films, everything's dark, morose, and just plain boring and depressing. There's really no sense of hope in his other films, especially movies like BVS and, you know, even 300, people like it a lot. I'm not a big fan of it. I thought it was just okay. I mean, probably for the time it was really, really good. Now, if I watch it now, I don't think I would feel the same way about it. But I rewatched Dawn of the Dead, and it still holds up really well. Number 2 is a movie that I've mentioned before on another top 5, and I'll probably be mentioning it in many other top 5 videos, and that is David Cronenberg's The Fly. This is probably a remake that surpasses the original, both technically and also in terms of storyline. The remake of The Fly takes the concept of the original movie from the 50s, which is a drive-in movie that was released on CinemaScope, and it did very well at the time. And they eventually made sequels like Return of the Fly and Curse of the Fly, which were okay, but they were released in black and white, which I find kind of silly, being the fact that the original Fly was released in color. So fast forward about 30 years, and they do a remake directed by David Cronenberg, best known for movies like Scanners and Videodrome. He remakes this movie and does a psychological film that's not just about a man who creates a teleportation machine that sends himself from one place to another and switches heads from a human head to a fly head. He's actually going through a metamorphosis. And they also use the fact that during the 80s, the mid-early 80s, where the epidemic of AIDS was very, very high, they use the concept of someone slowly losing their immune system and changing. And it was effective then and still effective now in terms of the storytelling, and it actually has, in my opinion, Jeff Goldblum's best performance. You can believe that this guy is slowly turning into a fly, because of course you can give credit to Chris Wallace, who made the special effects for The Fly, for doing the great practical effects that they did in that film. The difference also is that in the original, a fly gets in, you switch heads. In this one, he gets into a teleportation machine, which he calls telepods, and it genetically modifies his DNA. Like, the teleportation machine cannot separate 2 genetic patterns and instead just fuses them together. So he's trying to find a way to become human again. Watching them back to back, you can see how the 50s Fly was a product of its time and still a good little B-horror movie, but this one you can watch today and put it in the theater or play it in a movie night at a friend's house, and it still is effective. The effects still hold up. This is before the modern, advent of CGI. It was all practical, and I think it's still a movie that will be mentioned for many, many years to come. So I think this is one of those horror remakes that stands out. Number 1, what can be better than The Fly? Even though I gave a little big explanation for the Fly, this was tough because I actually wanted to put The Fly as number 1. But another one that stands out also for the great practical effects and also good script and great cinematography and also good music, which people don't mention very much, by Ennio Morricone, is The Thing, directed by John Carpenter. This is actually one of my favorite movies from John Carpenter. It holds up so well today. Everything was done practical. There was done a lot of puppeteering work. I don't want to reveal specific like monsters that appear in this film, but I will reveal the plot. The plot is basically an alien lands on Earth and it's trying to imitate the host, whether it be a dog, a human being, and they all start in something like in Antarctica, and they're trying to find out who within them is the alien, who is the creature. It creates a lot of tension. And that's why I've mentioned this before, that creating effective horror is the unknown. You are scared of the unknown. You're scared of what you can't explain. And you can't explain where this alien come from. You can't explain who got attacked and who became an alien. That's what makes it so scary. John Carpenter, this technique of directing has inspired a lot of people. People like Jordan Peele with the movie Get Out and movies like It Follows. And if you watch this movie, you would think, you know, especially on a Blu-ray 4K transfer, you would believe that this movie came out today. And it has some of Kurt Russell's best acting, in my opinion. You know, Kurt Russell's a very underrated actor from that time. He worked in a lot of movies with John Carpenter. And I think if you really like horror and if you really want to see a remake that stands out, this is actually the remake of a movie that came out around the same time, I think probably before The Fly, way before The Fly, early 50s, and it was called A Thing from Another World. And that movie on itself, it's a little classic B movie. Of course, the effects don't hold well because you can see the strings on the little spaceship. But it's a little classic, fun movie that can be watched with a family, not so much with the remake of The Thing. I think it's a movie that gets appreciation more each year as we're seeing crappier and crappier CGI. So all these 5 films that I mentioned stand out, and notice how not a lot of them are from now. Most of the ones that you see now, they're very forgettable. There's too many. There's an abundance of remakes. Most of the remakes that I mentioned were at a time when, well, with an exception of Evil Dead, but most of the ones that I mentioned were at a time when remakes weren't that common. Most of the movies that were released were original content. They were not adaptations of a comic book. They were not adaptations of a book or remakes of something that came before it. But these do stand out, and I think in many years to come, people are still going to watch them. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this top 5. Please let me know in the comment section down below if there's a horror remake that I didn't get a chance to mention. There's a lot of other ones that I didn't get to mention. I'm pretty sure you will find some and you'll put it on this list and let me know. Make sure to follow me on Instagram page under the name of Best Guy. I post there every now and then, both reviews and also thumbnails to these videos that you can find on YouTube. And also stick around because there's other people here on Dropping Loads channel that do a lot of cool stuff. So anyway, guys, I'm Best Guy, and until next time, bye.